Thank you for joining me on this talk on the origin of life. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Where did we come from is a question that we perhaps all ask at some stage, and it's one that science looks into. Were we created supernaturally, or are we the chance result of chemical reactions? Is there a God or no God? And what does the evidence reveal? And so these are really important questions. From a Christian worldview point of view, we believe in that God created the universe and the world in 6 days, thousands of years ago. And one of the bases for this evidence, of course, is the Bible and the Bible account, and also the historicity of Jesus Christ, who we have overwhelming evidence from history was a real person. And we also have very powerful evidence that he was literally resurrected, that he really was the Son of God. And this is really, very, very strong evidence. But also there are still challenges to, how does the origin of life fit in with this? We believe and know that the life was created, but not all scientists accept that particular position, and many scientists are looking for a mechanical or naturalistic explanation for life. One of the things, though, that's part of the Christian worldview is that the supernatural, the spiritual world, that is God, is eternal and is outside this physical world that we're in, this physical universe, this space-time system. And all the evidence to date also points to this space-time system had a beginning, whereas God does not have a beginning. And so this is a very important aspect to consider, that there was a supernatural or a spiritual existence long before the physical universe came into existence. But nonetheless, when we look at the science and the scientific explanations that are out there today, what does the evidence actually tell us about our origins? So let's have a look at that. The Bible records the testimony of people who experienced God and the supernatural events in their lives. So this is evidence from witnesses. So, for example, we see in the text, Exodus 34 verse 6, that the Creator God passed before Moses, and Moses recorded this as a witness. In Exodus 31:18, the Creator God gave Moses the 10 Commandments written on stone. So Moses recorded this. There are a lot of people at the time that were there at that particular time. Genesis chapter 1, that Moses also records for us, records the supernatural creation by God of the universe and life on earth in a 6 Earth Day time period. And so it's very important to understand that this is Earth Day time, because time, the notion of time is a property of the universe, and can vary depending on a number of conditions. On the basis of the spans in the Genesis chapter 5, the lifespans there and so forth, we can see that this event took place around 6,000 years ago, and we can look at that calculation perhaps in another talk. And Moses wrote down what God personally told him. And so we get that from Exodus 24:4. So put these up as some references in the Bible that we can look up and see. This is one of the bases of the Christian worldview. Now we also need to note that the New Testament records many eyewitness accounts that Jesus came from God and was God. Jesus affirmed Moses and the prophets and creation. And Jesus performed supernatural healings and control of nature in public as signs that he was God. So this is very important. Matter of fact, I think there's a text where Jesus says, look, believe in me. If you don't necessarily believe in me, but believe in me because of the signs and miracles that I do. So he provided evidence for people. Now, these many eyewitnesses faced fierce personal opposition and persecution and death, but stuck to their testimony of supernatural events. So this is very important to understand that science cannot study supernatural events. These are outside the normal workings of science from our physical, earthly, everyday science perspective, but they're not outside what God can do. And thus the supernatural creation points to a supernatural future life, and this gives us hope. Therefore, what is the evidence that life is supernatural? So let's have a look at this. Now, if we look at a secular worldview that doesn't want to have God as part of that worldview, we look at science education and research that rejects any event or phenomena that is supernatural. So people that hold this view have to explain the origin of life. That is, all the events and phenomena must be explained in terms of the laws of physics, chemistry and mathematics. Now, this is a philosophical position and it's imposed by scientists themselves. So it's not necessarily based on our observations. So this is a very important point to understand when we consider this situation, that this particular position, that there is only this physical world and that everything must be explainable in terms of the measurable physical laws of physics, chemistry and mathematics, is something that is imposed. It's not based on observation. It's imposed because of a worldview or a philosophy that does not want to have God as part of the explanation. So we need to understand that. So, according to most science textbooks, the first life appeared on Earth at least 2.5 billion years ago and possibly as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. But that is that they claim that life started from non-living chemicals. So these scenarios assume that there was just non-living chemicals, matter to start with, and that this is called chemical evolution. However, most textbooks do not explain how this could happen, and there's good reason for that. Now, every living organism on Earth is constructed by molecular machinery in the cell itself, in the little cells that compose the organism, or the cell that is the organism, which can read an instruction manual written in a special language. Now, this language consists of 4 specific tiny molecular structures, which are the letters of the language, so to speak. And it's a combination of these structures that is read and provides a code or a language that it provides the instruction then for the construction of that particular organism. So every different living organism has a different instruction manual, and we call that DNA. We refer to that as DNA. So chemical evolution requires, if it was to happen, it would require complex molecular machines and molecules to form by chance chemical reactions on biomolecules. Now, these biomolecules are fairly complex molecules, not like the simple molecules that we have of water, hydrogen, 2 hydrogen and oxygen, or carbon dioxide, carbon and 2 oxygen, these simple molecules. These are very complex molecules involving many, many atoms. Now, the DNA language has to also form by chance. In other words, the instruction manual, so that the cell can replicate itself the same and therefore survive, supposedly. This particular complex language also has to arise by chance. So the instruction manual, or DNA, for the replication of an organism to form by chance chemical reactions is required. Now, a non-living molecular structure to be somehow alive. And so if we have this structure and we have the DNA code and we have everything there, it's still just inert molecules. Somehow this structure has to be made alive, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. Now, an attempt to explain how life could form from chemicals was proposed in 1969 by Dr. Dean H. Kenyon, who was Professor of Biology at San Francisco State University. However, he came to realise that living cells are too complex to arise by chance chemical reactions. And he actually now believes life must have been created by God. Now, the reference for that, to look this up, if you Google Dean Kenyon, Darwin, just those words, and go to the Charles Darwin of our time on YouTube, and you'll see a presentation, his personal testimony in that area. Now, also, another very interesting scientist that works in this area is Dr. James M. Tour, and I've put his website there. You can see it's jmtour.com, and there's a section there on his under personal topics on evolution and creation. Now, Dr. Tour is one of the most highly cited synthetic chemists in the world. That is, he is a chemist that constructs new molecules at the nano level, tiny, tiny machines. He works at the tiny molecular level. And he states quite clearly that from the basis of our known chemistry, it's impossible for a living organism to form by chance. And he points out that not many, many scientists are not aware that it's actually impossible on the basis of our known chemistry. Another scientist who has worked in this area is Dr. Stephen Meyer. Earned his doctorate from Cambridge in the area of philosophy of science, and he has put out the book Signature in the Cell, which he points out is powerful evidence for a super-intelligence designer of the amazing systems that are in the cell. So that again supports the work that Dr. Tour does. So why do these leading scientists reject chemical evolution as the origin of life? And it's because biochemically it is impossible for a living cell to arise by chance chemical reactions. Living cells are amazing, complex, self-replicating chemical factories. Their origin must be supernatural. So there's no mechanical explanation for how a living cell could form. The issues are just, well, huge, as we'll see. So let's have a look at what the requirements for a simple cell to form are. First of all, biopolymers have to form. Now, these are very, very long chain molecules. Now, long chain molecules of these particular type tend to be unstable in the natural environment. And really, the only places, as far as I'm aware, that we see them forming are in living systems that already exist. So these very long chain molecules that are very sensitive to be broken down have to form in conditions in nature which just wouldn't happen. And Dr. Tour talks about this too on his website. Now, the DNA coding information system has to form, and also a code reading and protein assembly mechanisms also have to form. So you have to have this giant molecule that involves hundreds of thousands of atoms to form by chance, that is in actual fact a code that describes the structure of what is formed. So if you have random molecules coming together, it's just randomly forming this cell, what you have that is going to somehow live and survive, at the same time you have to have a code form that actually describes what has formed around it. And we can see, I mean, that's not going to happen. A code to write down what has happened around it, all by random chances. But then you have to have a machine that can actually translate what the code is saying and make it and assemble the parts for the next similar living cell so that it can replicate. And even if that happened, it would still, even if that system existed, it would still actually be dead. It wouldn't be alive, because in order for it to be alive, hundreds, not just a couple, but hundreds of chemical reactions have to be put out of balance by just the right amount, all at the same time, to start the life process. And so this is absolutely impossible. And James Tour, in one of his lectures talks about even just to try and assemble the molecules to form the outer membrane of a cell so it could survive in nature and be protected from all the natural environmental forces that are out there that would want to destroy it, the ultraviolet light and so forth, would be impossible at the present time for us to even do in the best laboratory. So he points out how that could happen in nature, again, just illustrates the impossibility of life forming by chance. Examples of the types of huge long chain biopolymer molecules that have to form, and not just one, but millions of these molecules have to form. And so you might have, say, 50 different types of molecules, but you've got millions of identical molecules have to form of millions of different types. So again, this picture, by random chance, millions of identical molecules have to form, all in this same location, of all the different types. And so we have to have, there are all different types of proteins have to form, all different types of long chain sugars have to form, all different types of long chain fats have to form. But again, not just one or two of these, millions of identical ones have to form, all in this same wild natural location in this pond or hot vent or wherever it is, and then have to assemble themselves into the cell. So as we can see, these millions of molecules have to somehow assemble themselves into a structure that works and has a protective barrier against the destructive forces of the environment. But such a structure would just be so complex, would just be complex, lifeless molecules. So as I said, it would still be dead. For this structure to become alive, hundreds of biochemical reactions have to simultaneously be in a state of disequilibrium or out of balance by just the right amount to provide just the right concentration of end product for the next reaction to go by just the right amount to form the next product that is required by the next reaction, and so on. This is impossible to achieve naturally. We know that. For example, the smallest known cell, Mycoplasma genitalium, contains millions of individual molecules consisting of hundreds of different types of chemicals arranged according to specific functions, and which take part in hundreds of different simultaneous chemical reactions to give life to the cell. The DNA code contains 580,000 pieces of code arranged as 471 genes. So this is the simplest living cell we know at the moment that can survive by itself. And so I think we can see, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a mathematician to realise it's absolutely impossible for life to form by chance. Even in the simplest known living cell, the code contains 580,000 code bases, 471 genes. This is equivalent to the formation, or the information rather, in one large textbook. So imagine all the information in a large textbook just arising by chance. A 2-year-old sitting at a typewriter and typing it out. And such perfect working codes could not arise by chance chemical reactions. So, and if you want to see the calculations, if you go to the website here, creation.com, and that is a really good website. Just Google creation.com, and up there in the search engine, if you entered in John Marcus biochemistry in 6 days, Or you could enter in my book, In 6 Days. Dr. John Marcus wrote a chapter in that book. The entire book comes up on that website there, and down on the left-hand side will be the list of the different 50 scientists that explain why they don't believe in creation. But John Marcus is a chemist, a biochemist, and he actually does the mathematical calculations that shows how it is absolutely impossible for even just one gene to form by chance. The probability is so small of that happening. It falls into the range that we define as impossible. And this is because the probability of less than 1 in 10 to the power 150 is regarded as impossible. So 1 in, if we had a number that was 1, 10 with 150 zeros following it, we would define that as impossible. 1 chance in that one. And the probability of just one small gene forming by chance is less than 1 in 10 with 190 zeros following it. And this is just for one gene, let alone the extra 470 genes required for the simplest life. So again, when we look at the mathematics, when we look at this systematically and scientifically, we have to say it's impossible. Life is impossible. Science has demonstrated that life is impossible. If we look at a cell, bacterium, E. coli bacterium contains about 2.4 million protein molecules made up of approximately 4,000 different types of proteins. So for some sort of simplest organism to evolve into an E. coli, which is just a simple bacterium, no nucleus, as I said, a very simple bacteria, relatively, and we can see the materials that are required for that living cell are enormous. They involve millions of components in the cell. Now, along with these proteins, it contains about 255,000 nucleic acid molecules made up of 660 different types of nucleic acids. And along with these nucleic acids are around 1.4 million long-chain sugar molecules made up of 3 different types of sugars. And along with these long-chain sugars, polysaccharides, are around 22 million fat molecules, lipid molecules, made up of 50 different types of lipids. And along with all these lipids are many millions of metabolic intermediate molecules made up of about 800 different types of chemical compounds, all of which have to be at just the right concentration, otherwise the cell would die. And so if we look at DNA of E. coli, it's 4,288 genes, each containing about 1,000 pieces of code. We can see there's an enormous amount of information here, enormous amount of information. And you can see there the number of genes that are involved in the different metabolic processes and functions of the cell. And it just goes on. But the interesting thing is that when we add up all these known genes at the time that the code was worked out, only 1,500 genes out of the just over 4,000 genes in the simple cell were accounted for in those tables that I put up. And the reason being that at the time of publication of the genome, the sequence, the genome sequence, the function of the remaining 2,700 genes had not been identified. Now, chemical evolution requires this complex information system to arise by chance, and yet we still haven't even worked out what a lot of those particular genes do, and yet they're there and they appear to have functions. And so reading the DNA code and replicating the cell components. So the DNA code reading mechanism is truly amazing and involves complex molecules which unwrap and copy the DNA code and then translate the copy to a protein and transport the copy to a protein-making factory. The complex molecules involved could not form by chance. So, for an illustration, the complex molecule process that have to arise by chance if you go to the and Google DNA replication WEHI, so that's Walter Elia Hall Institute, which is one of the research institutes associated with the University of Melbourne. And if you just Google DNA replication WEHI, it'll take you to that. There's the YouTube link there. You can see actually an animation of what is involved in translating the DNA code into a protein, and the amazing molecular machines that are in the cell that carry out that process. And we can see for such a complex structure of molecular polymers and chemicals, all at the right concentration and with just the right base code to coordinate function to form by chance, has been shown to be absolutely impossible by Dr. Meyer and many other scientists. And for details, if there's some good articles on discovery.org, that's another website that argues for powerful evidence for intelligent design in living systems. So the two basic premises of evolution are biogenesis, that a living organism formed from non-living components, and spontaneous generation of meaningful DNA have never been observed. Scientists have never observed a cell forming from non-living molecules. They can construct some of the molecules involved using complex series of chemical reactions in top laboratories, but it's nothing like what's out in nature. And the molecules that are even formed there are a long way from forming a meaningful DNA code and all the other thousands of types of molecules that are in a cell. And this is a very important argument has been elucidated here by Dr. James M. Tour, and you can see there's some references there. And this is what he points out. And he's talking about chemists that believe somehow that life can form by chance, and biologists, he points out. But try as they might, without pre-existing life, no researchers have ever seen molecules assembling into a living cell or anything even remotely resembling a living cell. So this is very important with our best laboratories today, with our top scientists. That's an important statement to bear in mind. And he goes on, scientists have no data to support molecular evolution leading to life. And so there's an article there, you'll see them on discovery.org. And also, James Tour, this is a very interesting website too here, jamesmtour.com, and you can see one of the content uploads where he talked about an article published by Stolzak, Professor Stolzak. He's a Nobel Prize winner. He's a professor of genetics at Harvard University, and he published an article in Nature quite recently. And what James Tour points out is that Stolzak's article oversimplifies the research that is being done that supposedly supports the possibility of chemical evolution. And this is a very important point. And what Dr. Tour points out in this article is that in reality, most chemists and biologists don't have a clue as to as to the complexity that is required to actually form a living cell, and that some of the chemical reactions that chemists have come up with that claim that can possibly form some of the components of the cell are in actual fact far more complex in actual detail than what the public is being told, and even the science community is being told. So this is a very important point. So what can we conclude? That it's scientifically impossible for a self-replicating living cell to form by chance. Therefore, the origin of living cells must be supernatural. And of course, this just confirms the biblical account that living things were created by God. And this is a very, very important point to understand. Science is cutting off this powerful evidence We have powerful evidence that life is supernatural, and yet science is saying, whoop, we can't go there, we can't study that. In the next presentation, I'll examine why all the different life forms on Earth could not have evolved by mutations and natural selection, and why creation is the only viable explanation for life on Earth. Thank you.